The infamous wage gap. The feminists claim that women make 83 cents for every dollar a man makes for doing the same job due to cultural and systemic prejudice against women. Now, there are a lot of videos addressing this claim already, but in this chapter of the Little Pink Book, I will use the statistics found in the report that this claim is based on to walk through a simple, back-of-the-envelope, first-order estimate of what we might expect the ratio of women's to men's earnings to be. First off, there are a few different figures out there regarding the earnings ratio, depending on the year and the source, all hovering around 80 cents on the dollar, at least in recent times. I will be looking at the 2014 Bureau of Labor and Statistics report, the link can be found below, which specifically claims that for weekly earnings, women's median earnings were 83% than those of male full-time wage and salary workers. To understand what this means, we must first understand what a median is. First thing to point out is that the median is not the average, otherwise called the mean. So what is the median? Let's say we have X amount of full-time female workers and Y amount of full-time male workers. In order to get the median full-time earnings, what you would do is take all of the full-time working women and arrange them from highest earner to lowest, assigning each worker a number such that the highest earner gets number 1, the next highest number 2, the next number 3, and so on until the lowest earner gets number X, because there are X women. In reality, the BLS report groups the workers in $50 bins, but the principle is the same. Then we do the same with men. Then, in each list, we find the worker whose position is in the middle of the list, such that half of the workers in the list are above and half below. And the salary that person makes is the median. The 83 cents on the dollar is simply found by taking the ratio of those two numbers. So what can we conclude from this? We can conclude that half of the full-time working women make more than $719 a week and half less. And half of the full-time working men make more than $871 a week and half less. And that's it. Can we say that women are paid 83% of what men are paid for doing the same job? Absolutely not. The two people whose salaries we compared almost certainly do not have the same job, experience, education, or for all we know, anything in common. They just both happen to be at the midpoint of their respective lists. We certainly can't conclude anything as to why those medians are different, such as prejudice, sexism, men are pigs who hate women, etc. In fact, this ratio by itself is so meaningless that the fact that it was reported on the front page of the BLS report, as if it were of the utmost importance, to me reeks of a hidden and dishonest agenda. Now, I'd like to look at another report put out by the BLS that same year, looking at the average amount of hours worked by men and women. The link can also be found below. In it is this graph showing the average amount of hours worked on weekdays, weekend days, and on the average day. If we look at the full-time workers columns, we see that men work more hours than women on average. It's important to notice here that only days on which people worked are included. And yes, I know I just said the average and median aren't the same, but let's just proceed as if they're at least similar and try to make a quick ballpark estimate on what we should expect the earnings ratio to be. To do this, all we need is some basic 7th grade math. First, let's put the relevant numbers off to the side. Now, because we only have the average number of hours worked on days people actually worked and not just on an average day, we have to do a little bit of work to figure out the average amount of hours worked a week. If we take the average hours worked on a weekday, given that a person works on that day, times the number of weekdays worked, plus the average hours worked on a weekend day, times the number of weekend days worked, and then divide by the total number of days worked, we get the average hours worked on a workday. Rearranging this, we get an expression for the number of weekend days worked for every weekday worked. Now, we don't actually know the number of weekdays worked, but let's say it's 5. In reality, it's probably a little bit less because of days off and holidays, and not all full-time workers work Monday through Friday, but let's just assume every full-time worker works Monday through Friday and sometimes on the weekends. We're just looking for a ballpark estimate anyway. Now, the average number of hours worked per week is the number of weekdays worked times the average amount of hours worked per weekday worked, plus the number of weekend days worked times the average number of hours per weekend day worked. Plugging everything in, we get that on average, full-time working women work 45 hours a week and full-time working men work 51 hours a week. Now, let's say that we live in the Marxist utopia that the feminists are always demanding and assume that everyone in the country makes the same hourly wage regardless of their job. In this case, the ratio of women's to men's earnings is simply the ratio of the hours they work, which turns out to be 88%, or 88 cents on the dollar, as they say. This is already pretty close to the reported 83 cents on the dollar. But actually, if you work more than 40 hours a week, you're paid time and a half for overtime hours. So let's erase our result and include overtime. Women on average worked 40 hours at regular pay, plus 5 hours of overtime at time and a half pay. And men on average worked 11 hours of overtime. Now, the women's to men's earning ratio is 84%. That's pretty damn close to 83%. And all I've considered here is the differences in hours worked, assuming a feminist Marxist utopia. I haven't even considered that people who work more hours are more likely to get raises, differences in occupation pay, differences in occupation choice, education, etc. If you consider all those things, the expected ratio would probably drop well below 83%, suggesting that actually it's men being paid less for the same job. Although that's purely speculative based on a back-of-the-envelope estimate in which median and mean are treated as similar, so don't quote me on that. But even if you're a feminist who failed 7th grade math and had to resort to a useless career in women's studies, you can ignore everything I just said and go to the very same BLS report and turn to the technical notes section on page 71, where they clearly explain the earnings comparison in this report are on a broad level and do not control for many factors that can help explain earnings differences. This includes the direct comparisons of earning levels among demographic groups and the women's to men's earnings ratios shown in the tables, that is, women's earnings as a percentage of men's. For example, the overall ratio of women's to men's earnings for full-time workers presented here is not controlled for differences in important determinants of earnings such as age, occupation, and educational attainment. The earnings comparison in this report are not restricted to workers with otherwise comparable characteristics and comparable jobs. Even controlling for one of the factors may not fully explain earnings differences. Comparison of women's and men's earnings by detailed occupation, for example, are not simultaneously controlled for differences in key factors such as job skills, responsibilities, work experience, and specialization. That is to say, they literally tell you in the report that the 83 cents on the dollar does not in any way mean women earn less for the same job, and that none of the differences in hours worked, occupation, etc. have been taken into consideration. They literally say it. All you have to do is read the report. So why are feminists still adamantly making this wage gap claim? Is it possible that they're so incompetent that they can't do basic math or even read? Very unlikely. We have little choice but to conclude that the wage gap is a deliberate lie. Why, you might ask? That is the subject of a different chapter in the Little Pink Book, titled Feminist Agenda. If you enjoyed this chapter in the Little Pink Book, please be sure to like and subscribe. And of course, feel free to comment. Thanks for watching.